Scripture is from John 8, 2 through 11. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teacher of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery, and they made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this time, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one accused you? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now, leave your life of sin."
There was a young couple who had just gotten married. And like all young couples, they were a little nervous. They didn't know everything about each other, and they'd gone on their honeymoon. And the husband was sitting on the edge of the bathtub in the bathroom, and he was all concerned because he had not, in the course of the courtship, revealed to his now wife that he had smelly feet. And so he didn't know what to do. In the meantime, his wife was sitting on the bed, concerned because she had never really confessed to her husband, even though they'd been, dating, and, she had used mints and all kinds of stuff to hide this, but she had horrible breath. So the husband determined, okay, I have to go tell. So he came out of the bathroom and he walked over to the bed. He sat down next to her, said, "Honey, I have a confession to make. I have horrible smelling feet." And she looked at him face to face and said, "Honey, I have a confession to make to you." And he said, "Oh no, you ate my socks." Now, I know you didn't have any conversations like that. I don't think you did with your spouse on your honeymoon night or anything like that. But did you ever think, husbands and wives have this unusual relationship in that you know everything about each other. You know your foibles, you know your bad habits, your good habits, you know everything about each other. But have you ever wondered what God thinks of you? Have you ever stopped to think, God knows everything about me and yet still loves me? In the 139th Psalm, starting in verse 1, we find these words, "O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. And you know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. And before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord." Now, as much as a husband and wife may know each other very, very well, that's unbelievable knowledge. That God can understand the very thoughts that you have. He understands the words that come to you, even before they're on your tongue. And the psalmist here says, you know what, this is unbelievable. You know when I lie down, you know when I get up. And then you realize that he's always around. In verses 7 and 8, he says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go into heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." And you've heard me say this before. People say, "Where was God? Where was God in the middle of this tragic shooting in Florida?" I tell you where God was. He was right in the middle of it. We think God has left the scene. We think God has checked out. But God is always there, and it's the same thing in your life. He is always there. He knows your sorrows. He knows what's going through your mind. He knows the things that you're struggling with. And then you skip down to verse 13, and you read this. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb, and I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden for you when I was made in the hidden place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And again, this intimate knowledge that God knows everything about you is just too wonderful for us to understand. There's an interesting story in the Old Testament, and some people have said, well, this is just an allegory. And I don't know that it's an allegory or not. I think it may be a true story. But it's found in the book of Hosea. In Hosea chapter 1, we'll start in verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery and departing from the Lord. Let's stop there for just a moment. God tells Hosea, go get you a woman who cheats on you. Let that sink in for just a minute. And he's talking about Israel here, of course, but he's telling Hosea, I want you to understand what this is all about. So I want you to get this adulterous woman. And then he goes on and says, so he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel. Let's stop here for just a minute again. You see, Jezreel was a valley, an area where some of the Israelites had some of their greatest victories. They had some great victories in Jezreel. God says, I want you to do this because of the punishment. But I wonder if Hosea was thinking, oh, wow, man, victory, here we go. I've got a wife. Now maybe this victorious name will come to my household, and maybe it's not going to be as bad as it seems. Let's go on. Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And then the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo-ruhamah, for I will no longer show love to the house of Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Well, that sounds a little different, doesn't it? You go from victory to Lo-ruhamah, which means not loved. You get the indication that maybe this isn't Hosea's child. Perhaps what we have here is Gomer has already cheated on him. Because you have this child that's called not loved. How would you like to have that name? What's your name? Well, nobody loves me. That was the name of this child. Then he goes on and says, yet I will show love to the house of Judah. I will save them not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but by the Lord their God. And after she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, Gomer had another son. And then the Lord called him Lo-ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. And again, you have this concept, this indication that perhaps this child doesn't even belong to Hosea, because he's named not my people, not mine. God's pursuit of us in the history of the world is pretty amazing. When you see stories like this that we find in Hosea, it gives us pause, it stops us, it makes us think, what in the world is going on? And if our concept of God is that he's dying to catch us in a trap of sin and a lie, in some kind of sin, that's so far from the truth. This is not a long one like I had last week. Don McLaughlin is a friend of mine. He went to Harding many years ago and speaks quite often. He wrote a book called Love First. I keep talking about Bob Goff, Love Does. This is Love First. But he tells this story. When I was 11, I stole a bicycle chain and lock from a department store. I didn't want anyone to steal my bike. And once again, this book enhances your compassion for parents, he says. But after I successfully shoplifted the lock and chain, I became a regular. Soon I had quite a store of stolen goods under my mattress. I couldn't sleep, and it wasn't because of the lump of pilfered treasure I was sleeping on. My fifth grade mind was racked with guilt, and I was a wreck. I walked past my dad 3 or 4 times, pausing long enough for him to look up and say, "What's up?" "Nothing," I would choke out and then go back to my room. What was I going to do? Finally, I went to him, burst into tears, and couldn't get anything to come out of my mouth. And I just motioned to him to come follow me. We went into my bedroom where I threw up the mattress to expose the evidence of my transgressions. He looked a little puzzled. What in the world? A can of paint, some dice, a black light poster, the chain and lock, and a smashed vinyl record. I know, give me a break. I was 11. In between my heaving sobs, I told him the sordid story of my crime spree. We finally sat down on the bedroom floor and came up with a plan. I earned money from selling papers. I had enough to pay for the stolen good. Crime does not always make sense. The plan for me was to return the goods and pay for them and take whatever punishment the infractions deserved. When Dad and I arrived at the store, I was carrying the bag of loot. We found the manager, and I was fighting back the tears as I handed him the strange bag of items and explained what I had done. And then I gave him the money to pay for them. And I guess it was my lucky day because the store manager decided to make an example of me in front of a growing crowd of bobbing heads and stares. He loudly scolded me for my misdeeds, and I hung my head. I said I was sorry. I felt so awful. But he just kept going. I guess he didn't get too many repentant shoplifters to yell at, so maybe I was taking one for the team. But it started to get a little extreme. He began to lay into me about what a sorry son I was and that he was sure my parents had to be ashamed of me. That final statement evoked a different voice, one that would meet me in my messes and move me forward toward the light many times over. Dad gently interrupted the store manager, 20 years his junior, and asked, "Have you said your piece?" The store manager took a much-needed breath. "What?" he stammered. "Have you said your piece?" my dad repeated. "Are you satisfied with the consequences?" "Well, yes, I guess so," he reluctantly acquiesced. "Then," my dad continued, "how about if you be the store manager and I will be his dad?" And with that, we walked out of the store. And I will be his dad meant that I was still his son. I think that's what we need to understand about God's pursuit of us. He may get angry with us. There are times when we do stupid things, but we are still his children. As much as the world comes down on us. And when we read in 1 Corinthians and its description of love, we must remember that God is love. And so when Paul says these kind of things, that love always protects and it always trusts and it always hopes and it always perseveres and it never ends, he's talking about God. When I was a freshman in college, I went to school with a girl who, for lack of a better term, well, she was ugly on the outside. Her nose was just kind of smashed in. It was flat. It was just, she just wasn't very pretty at all. And spring break, she said, "Just wait till after spring break. I'm going to have my nose worked on." And so we were excited about it for her. Okay, this is going to help. She's going to have some kind of plastic surgery. And she came back and she said, "How do you like my new nose?" We kind of looked at each other and said, It's beautiful. It looks the same. And she said, isn't it beautiful? And we just couldn't believe it. We're like, what in the world is she talking about? There's nothing new about that. I started thinking about that story. How many times have you been with parents, kids that may not be that attractive? And I know you're going to get on to me about, all babies are beautiful and that kind of stuff. I'm sorry, not all babies are beautiful. They look like little space aliens sometimes. But to a parent, they're the most beautiful thing in the world. They are the most beautiful thing in the world. Grandparents are even worse at this. I got to tell you that. I've experienced that. Because I keep seeing on Facebook, I have the cutest baby in the world. That's not true because I do. But the Bible says, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. Isn't that an interesting verse? That love covers over a multitude of sins. We will overlook things because they are mine. Do you think that God overlooks things sometimes because we belong to Him? You say, well, God can't overlook everything. Well, yes, He does because He provided the cost, which was His Son. I love the way God sees us. He sees you as pure and holy and clean. And He pursues us. But for some reason, we don't understand that. We don't believe it. We think, no. We're going to do everything we can to tarnish that. And a passage that I've used over and over is the way that He sees us. It says, so from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Why do we do that? Because God sees us differently. When you look at the history of Israel, I don't want to go through the whole thing. You know it. But you think about from the time that God made the promise to Abraham. And you go all the way through. You've got Joseph. You've got Joseph, and you get into Egypt, and then from there they come out. Moses leads them out, and you have them right off the bat. I mean, God does these unbelievable things, and Moses goes up on the mountain. The first thing they do is make a golden calf. And then, it's rebellious the whole time. They gripe about not having food. They gripe about not having any water. God provides over and over and over again. And we go through all this kind of stuff. And then they say, you know what? We want a king. We want a king. And so they go through all of this, and finally God, he takes them into captivity. He allows them to go into captivity, and yet He saves them. And after this heartbreaking story that we just read about in Hosea, where he has a wife who cheats on him, his children probably aren't his, God makes a comparison there that says, this is just like us. This is just like me and Israel. Because in Hosea chapter 11, he says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Adnah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. And I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I turn and devastate Ephraim. For I'm God and not man, and I will not come in wrath. Well, let's go to the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 18, there's an interesting passage. Sheep were important to the economy of Palestine. It was, and you think about this, it goes back for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. A lot of shepherds in the Bible. You got Abel was a shepherd, Jacob was a shepherd, David was a shepherd, Moses and others. I mean, they were all shepherds. And it must have been something very visual. You must have been able to see sheep everywhere in Palestine. Jesus is always referring to this. And starting in verse 10 of chapter 18 of Matthew, he says, See that you don't look down on one of these, for I tell you that the angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think, he says? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go look for the one who's wandered off? And if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he's happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. And in the same way, listen, in the same way your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost. Does that tell you something about God and his pursuit of you? Just one is all it takes. Now, I want to go back to the passage that Dan read earlier in John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, you have this woman that's caught in the act of adultery. We've talked about this before. She's caught in the act of adultery. So if she's caught in the act of adultery, how much is she wearing? Probably nothing. And it's at dawn. He appears in the temple courts. The people are all gathered around. He sat down to teach them. So in other words, there's a pretty good crowd. And the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery, and they made her stand before the group. Jesus says, and they say to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and in the law of Moses it commands us to stone such women." I think I would have said something. I wonder if Jesus wanted to say something like, "Where's the guy?" But he didn't. They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. And it says, but Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground. Did he get down like this? Did he just kneel down? This woman is standing there, and lots of people have speculated, why did he kneel down? What did he write down? He may have just been a diversion, just to get people, if she's naked standing in front of them, they get down and they say, what's he doing, And they get their eyes off her. Maybe in the meantime, somebody brings her something to wear. But he stoops down. And it says he started to write, and when they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said, "Is any one of you without sin? Let him be the first to throw a stone." Now, we have taken that passage out of context and used it ourselves when somebody has come to us and said, "You are not doing right." Well, if you're without sin, you cast the first stone. No. You're not allowed to use that. That's Jesus saying that to the accusers. Some people speculate that he was writing the sins of these people. There's an indication in the Greek that he's making a list of something. But nevertheless, what they end up doing is leaving one at a time. But Jesus gets down on his knees. As I was reading this, I noticed that the woman's standing. I wonder if at some point that she slinks down. The image I have in my mind is Jesus getting down on his knees and looking her in the eye and saying, "Where are the others?" And she says, "They're gone. They're not here." And he says, "I don't condemn you." And I don't know if he takes her by the hand and lifts her up. I don't know if I may be way off on this. And some people say, well, you just can't allow sin to go on. Jesus didn't. Notice what he says. Leave your life of sin. In essence, he says, let's not do this anymore. But to think that we have a Savior who will get down on his hands and knees for us, who will look us straight in the eye and say, "I don't condemn you." And you look at that passage in Hosea where he says, "I just can't do it, you're my children." That's the God that we serve. That's the God of pursuit. That's the God who never lets go. and He has called us to be His children. That's a story. We're going to sing an invitation song here that Travis has selected. I want you to understand that God loves you so much. He's pursuing you with all His might. He doesn't want to let go. It's like that dog that grabs a hold of that sock and just won't let go. God is not going to let go. There comes a time at the end of His patience where, yes, justice has to come. But it takes a while. Our shepherds and their wives will be in the foyer. If you need prayers, we'll pray for you right now, right up front. We'll do whatever we can. Whatever your need today, would you come as we stand and sing?